The Dechronization of Sam Magruder has to be one of the most fascinating science fiction dinosaur books I have read in a while. The story depicts a man who accidentally slips through the fabric of time and is transported to a lost era 80 million years in the past, where he's forced to use nothing more than his own intelligence and will to live to survive for as long as he possibly can from the deadly elements of the late Cretaceous period. While the book itself is fairly simple on surface level, the story is actually deep with themes and philosophies regarding the emotional and social ties that make us human. The way it's presented brings up a lot of interesting takes and discourse based around the rather depressing yet interesting thought experiment of what a man would do if they were transported to a place and time, in this case the late Cretaceous period, where they had no one but themselves to talk and think to. It's also a book that's backed up by real-world theories and research and beliefs about dinosaurs and evolution, as this story was actually made by a very influential scientist named George Gaylord Simpson. Simpson had written and published several books during his time, but they were mainly informational books based on his research about paleontology and evolutionary history. The Dechronization of Sam Magruder was an outlier to the rest of his works, as it focused more on a fictional character in a science fiction story. But what makes it even more interesting to me is that this book was actually published after Simpson's death. I'll explain more about why this is so interesting to me after I go through the book though. I think you guys will have a better gauge of what I'm talking about once you get the context of the story itself. But before we get into that, I quickly want to talk about the book's author and why they're so important to the world of paleontology. I'm sure that my more science-absorbed viewers will know who George Gaylord Simpson is, but for those of you that don't, he was an American paleontologist born in 1902. He dedicated most of his life to studying prehistoric life, more specifically in mammalian paleontology, as he would get his doctorate in 1926 from Yale University, with his thesis being on Mesozoic mammals. Shortly after, in 1927, he would land a job working at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, where he would spend the next 30 years studying prehistoric life and writing several papers and books based on his findings. During his time here, he would find time to analyze and study lower invertebrates and on the fauna in Florida from during the Neogene period and Pleistocene epoch. He would also take interest in the history of prehistoric mammals from South America during the early Neogene era, as this part of these organisms' history was relatively more obscure than that of their later counterparts of the region. So Simpson would make a few trips to Patagonia, where he would write several papers and a couple of books that shed more light in this area of prehistory. He also studied Cretaceous mammals from Mongolia and North America, and in total he would write about 150 scientific papers on these various topics, a lot of which are considered to be major contributions to prehistoric mammalian organisms and their evolutionary history. For a period of time, he left to North Africa to work for the US Army during World War II, but when he came back, he was made curator of the paleontology department of the American Museum of Natural History. Along with this, around the same time, he would also start teaching vertebrate paleontology at the University of Columbia. Here, he would branch out and study other fields of science through his work on paleontology. These other fields included mathematics, geography, taxonomy, and classification, all of which he would pretty much apply to his work in paleontology. But in 1958, he would move to Massachusetts and become a professor of vertebrate paleontology at the Harvard Museum of Comparative Zoology for a while, before moving again to Arizona and becoming a professor of geosciences at the University of Arizona. Finally, in 1982, he would retire, but that wouldn't stop him from publishing a few more of his studies from when he was active. Over the years, Simpson had written many books, including Attending Marvels, a Patagonian Journal, Temp and Mode in Evolution, The Major Features of Evolution, The Geography of Evolution, Splendid Isolation, and several more. Keep in mind that everything I've said about this guy is just a fraction of him and his works. From the start, Simpson was considered to be an adequate and dependable scientist, and he spent literal decades working as a paleontologist, applying different methods to the field, making important discoveries, and overall massively contributing to our understanding of certain prehistoric organisms. To give you an idea of just how important people consider Simpson to be, there are many sources that I ran into during my research on him and his book that consider him to be the greatest and most important paleontologist since Georges Cuvier. However, in all of his roster of papers and books, there was one that deviated from the rest. But not in a way that was overly egregious, though you'll come to see that some of the ideas in his book are not the most accurate, but it did deviate from the type of books that he usually wrote, that being more science-heavy with the main intent to be more informational. But this outlier was a short science fiction novella that did incorporate elements of real-world information and theories about prehistoric life, but was also a fictional story that took these elements and did something different with them. Without further ado, let's take a look at the Dechronization of Sam Magruder. The book is set in the future, where a group of friends and colleagues are gathered together. One of these men had gathered them here to show them a life-changing discovery that he and his associates made. The people that make up this group are not given names, but rather labels. There's the universal historian, the pragmatist, the ethnologist, and the common man. There's also another person in the group who's telling this part of the story from their perspective, but they're never given a name or a label, possibly indicating that this person might just be us as a reader, as a way to immerse us more into the story, but I'm not entirely sure. Going back to the story, the universal historian starts the chapter off by asking his colleagues a question. What would you do, what could you do, if you knew you were going to be utterly alone for the rest of your life? This leads to a bit of discourse on the matter, with everyone giving a response, with the pragmatist saying that a scenario like that was impossible because there wouldn't be a situation in which a man would be so hopelessly alone that he wouldn't be able to make contact with others in one way or another. The common man responds to this by saying that there have been points in time where there have been people lost on islands and in space that were never heard from again due to their inability to get back in touch with others. And while the universal historian somewhat agrees with what these men were saying, he responds with, in a physical sense they were alone. It's also true in such cases that they remained, in fact, alone for the rest of their lives. But I was thinking of the psychological, the emotional situation. If you knew with complete conviction that nothing you did could possibly be observed by anyone else, would it seem worthwhile to do anything? If it were certain that no other human being would ever touch your existence, would you value that existence? He goes on to say that those people in the past that were never heard from again, that lost their way from civilization, were still examples of people who had the chance to make it back, and thus gave them enough hope to not be convinced of their eternal loneliness. The question that the universal historian is trying to present to his colleagues is, how would a man react if he was incapable of ever returning to or receiving any communication from the human world? The pragmatist answers by saying it isn't possible, and this scenario can only really be answered through speculation. But the universal historian says that he is wrong, and admits that his question was leading to something that he wanted to introduce to his friends. What he wanted to tell his friends was a story about a man in this exact situation, one where he was hopelessly alone with no communication from the human world. And while he had no way of receiving word from other people, he was able to leave a story behind for others to discover, and that is the story that the universal historian wants to tell his friends. At first, his colleagues, mainly the pragmatist, were skeptical about the legitimacy of this story, but the universal historian claims it to be true. The man in the story was named Sam Magruder, a scientist from 2162 studying quantum theory, who ended up being the victim of dechronization, which is what the story describes as a time slip, which caused him to fall through the strands of time and land in the Mesozoic era 80 million years ago. Of course, this is followed by skepticism, but during these meetings that the group have every week, the universal historian takes time to explain how this event is possible with the theory of dechronization. Dechronization is actually a word that was made up for this story, but its basic meaning is that it's the disengagement of the chronological order of something. In this case, that something is referring to time. There was a disconnection to the chronological order of time that Sam ended up slipping through. Sam was actually a chronologist that was studying the theory of dechronization. At one point, the Universal Historian brings out a newsprint sheet that details all that is known about Sam Magruder's disappearance on the day of February 30th, 2162. It states that the scientist had been working at the Chronological Institute in his laboratory with 2 other people that were his assistants. At the time, Sam was conducting experiments relating to the quantum theory of time motion, and as he went to switch on the experimental apparatus, he began to collapse on the floor. His assistants both go to grab him, but all they ended up grabbing were Sam's clothes. Sam Magruder had disappeared into thin air. No one could properly explain what had happened that day, but given the circumstances and the evidence that the Universal Historian would provide next, he's convinced that Sam had been a victim to a time slip. At this point, the pragmatist, who definitely bickers with the Universal Historian the most out of anyone in the group, points out that this doesn't prove anything. Other sources say it's possible Sam himself was dissolved, and this story of a time slip has no merit without any proper evidence. That's when the Universal Historian brings out the slabs. For this, the Universal Historian brings in one of his associates by the name of Pierre Precieux, who explains that he and a team of scientists had explored the northern regions of North America and progressively made their way down south throughout the span of about 20 years. And just a couple of years before this current point in time, they reached New Mexico and Arizona, where they established a base camp over a geological formation. While collecting samples from a shale deposit, he would end up uncovering a hard piece of sandstone slab engraved with a lot of markings on it. Upon further inspection, it was realized that these markings were actually a readable language. And after digging around the area, a total of 8 sandstone slabs were found with the same kind of markings. They were all dated to be from 80 million years ago and were the last recorded messages of Sam Magruder that tells the story of what the rest of his life was like in the late Cretaceous period. At this point in the story, we finally transition from the perspective of the group of men in the present day to the perspective of Sam Magruder 80 million years ago. There were a total of 8 slabs, which are how the chapters are divided up from this point on. In the first slab, Sam tries to make sense of what had happened during the time slip. He explains that the goal of his experiment was to find out whether the present point in time moves continuously or in little jumps. But to find out whether or not the present moves in little jumps would be hard, as they are way too small to notice with our normal time perception. So Sam's goal was to slow that time perception down by a lot, and he did this by gradually slowing time down before he began to notice a flickering that he thought was a part of the time jumps, and, pun fully intended, he jumped the gun on this and pulled the lever down all the way, and before he knew it, he was standing butt naked in a swamp, completely unaware at first as to what happened. He theorizes that what might have happened was that time decelerated to a point where it just completely stopped, which caused him to briefly be sent out of the present and into a different time universe, but when he came back, he had been displaced in a completely different era, 80 million years before human evolution. A second ago, he was in his laboratory, but now he was in a prehistoric swamp in the Mesozoic era, and he learns quickly about his predicament, especially after he makes his first encounter with the dinosaur. But Sam is a pretty lucky dude though, because as dangerous as being in the Cretaceous sounds, his first encounter is not with any kind of theropod dinosaur or carnivorous creature, but rather an unsuspecting Alamosaurus. The sauropod dinosaur emerges from the swamp, and at first, Sam confuses it with a Diplodocus. So, quick side note, earlier in the book, the Universal Historian had said that he and his team had put all of the engraved words from the slabs onto paper, which he then printed copies of and handed them out to his colleagues listening to the story. Throughout the book, there are these little footnotes that the historian and his team left that give a bit more context, to the best of their knowledge, of course, of the more uninformed things from Sam's writings. things. Because Sam's a chronologist, and while he said in the story that he had taken a paleontology course at one point and knows a bit about his dinosaurs, there are points, such as now, where he doesn't completely know what he's facing. The only reason why I was able to say this was an Alamosaurus was because of the footnote that guesses that's what Sam was most likely referring to, as the other inhabitants of this time period that will be mentioned later will suggest this is the Cretaceous period and the Diplodocus didn't live in the Cretaceous, it lived during the Jurassic period. I won't go through every single footnote as not all of it is actually important to the overall story, but they do give out some information of what may be going on in the story, which is actually a really nice touch because it really adds on to the mystery of the entire situation. You have this man that's transported to this different era of time that no other man can reach, and he writes his experiences down, but obviously he can't write about every single detail, and we have no way to observe him. So this leads to a lot of holes and mystery in the story, a lot of blank spaces that the historian and his team try to fill in with their own guesses in the form of these footnotes, but nothing is truly definitive. So it kind of just leaves you in the dark a bit. There's something almost unsettling about the unknown of this story, and I think that's in part the tone that's set for it. The whole story is less of an exciting adventure in the age of the dinosaurs as we usually see portrayed in media, but instead the approach that Simpson takes with this story is much more serious and depressing. It makes it sadder when you learn more about Sam. He's just a normal guy, he didn't have a wife or biological kids, but he still had a sister, an adopted daughter, a dog, and many friends back in the present. People that he would never get a chance to see ever again. But along with that, all of the normal things that he's so used to experiencing in his normal day in the human world, listening to music, walking his dog, reading a book, studying quantum theory, or all of the social aspects of his life, like talking with his friends or family. All of these things he will no longer be able to do anymore. Sam is literally the only person on Earth at this point in time. No other human will emerge on this planet for another 80 million years. Sam isn't just lonely in the sense that he has no one to talk to. He's completely exiled from the entire human experience. And a lot of people might have called it quits from here. Why try to survive when it's just you and only you for the rest of your life in a time that you don't even belong in? And Sam even contemplates this after his first day and the reality of his situation really kicks in. At this point, he's just ceased to care and even begins crying. It is only when he becomes hungry when his instinct to survive kicks in. He tries searching for food among the vegetation and even tries to craft his own bow and arrow to hunt something with, but both of these attempts would fail. He wasn't able to find adequate food from the vegetation, and his bow would end up breaking apart as he was trying to shoot a lizard. This would send him into another emotional episode, and the following day, things would only get worse. On top of not being in the best condition with sunburns and blisters and a high fever, he also becomes completely hysterical. At one point, the book literally says that Sam starts making more bows and arrows, but one by one after crafting them, he would proceed to just break them on purpose. He would finally snap out of it when he would make his next major encounter with a dinosaur, this time with a Tyrannosaurus. The large theropod dinosaur notices the scientist and charges. But, frozen in fear, Sam doesn't think to move until his fight or flight response finally kicks in last second, causing him to dodge to the side away from the dinosaur, which catches the T-Rex off guard. When he sees Sam again, he charges a second time, but Sam is able to dodge it again and hides among the vegetation, where the dinosaur literally ends up losing its concentration on its potential prey, forgets what it was charging at, and just wanders off. All of this excitement with his first theropod encounter had made Sam thirsty, so he goes over to the lagoon to take a drink. But when he goes over to the lagoon's edge to dip his finger into the water to test the temperature, something comes up and bites off his finger, which he later finds out was a crocodile. He goes to treat the wound, and luckily for Sam, it doesn't get infected, but it does take days to heal. All things considered though, when you're in a situation like Sam's, it could have been a lot worse, and even he seems to think that he was lucky to lose just a finger and nothing more. That being said, things were finally looking up after he was able to find an easy meal after killing and eating a turtle, and was able to make some kind of clothing or cover-up from reeds that he made into mats that he weaved together. This marked the first couple of days of Sam's time here in the Cretaceous, which he considered to be one of the most important since it was the start of a new life for him. But from this point on, he didn't really bother keeping track of the days or keeping up with everything that he did every day. His focus was on survival and not documenting his life, but at some point he would return to engraving on the slabs to document some of the highlights of his time here in the Cretaceous when he had the time to do that. During his first year here, he did some traveling and managed to find a permanent home for himself in an area that he calls Pentaceratops Valley because that's where Pentaceratops reside in. He's encountered all kinds of new dinosaurs as well aside from the Pentaceratops. He's run into several hadrosaurs, one of them being Edmontosaurus. He's run into new enemies like Gorgosauruses, or at least what he assumes to be Gorgosauruses. In truth, this was more of a guess on his part, but these theropod dinosaurs were smaller than the T-Rexes, and as a result, were more agile. So he couldn't dodge them like he dodged the T-Rex. In his encounter with the Gorgosaurus, Sam was forced to climb up a tree to get away from it. But because dinosaurs in this book are not depicted as very smart animals, after the Gorgosaurus chases Sam up a tree and snaps at him a few times, it ends up just kind of forgetting what it was doing and just wanders off. Another dinosaur that's depicted as being not just dumb, but dumb even for a dinosaur, are the coelurosaurs. In his first days in the valley, Sam ran into a resting coelurosaur that didn't notice him, so he grabs a rock and smashes it over the dinosaur's head, which marks Sam's first major kill and provides him with both food and resources. At one point in the book, when he's describing the coelurosaurs, he says they are moronic even for dinosaurs, and it is relatively easy for a determined hunter to stalk them. As long as he is not visible, they think themselves safe, and with luck can be overcome by a quick dash from cover and a slash from a hunting spear. One reason why this book is really cool is because Simpson includes a lot of commentary regarding ideas and theories and beliefs about dinosaurs, some of which I believe were supposed to be references for how people used to view them, which were as dumb, oversized lizards. This is also made apparent with how he decided to approach the larger theropod dinosaurs as well. Another point of the story, Sam is going into detail about how scientists believe dinosaurs were smart and possibly warm-blooded animals, but confirms that the dinosaurs he's encountered are in fact cold-blooded animals that are not very smart. When he's describing the T-Rex, he comments on the dinosaur's sluggish reptilian metabolism, and how they're only really active during the day because they need the sunlight to warm them up, and during the night, they reach a state of torpidity that keeps them immobile. I'm not really sure how much of this were references to outdated ideas, and how much of this were Simpson's own beliefs on the topic of paleontology. But there is an afterwards in the book that actually goes through all of the references he made throughout the story, and at one point, it does say that apparently Simpson wasn't all too convinced with Robert Bacher's ideas, stating, "Simpson's dyspepsia towards the young Turks of his field, particularly towards Bob Bacher's arguments for warm-blooded dinosaurs, largely pushed in the popular press, and also to Simpson's immense displeasure for this reason, emerges in a particularly sharp passage." And the sharp passage that this part is referring to is a tangent in the book where Sam is describing how living amongst the dinosaurs had made him realize they were actually cold-blooded creatures, and that in the human world, the news about warm-blooded dinosaurs was really only a temporary story that was pushed as sensational news that really had no evidence behind it, and as a result, the idea would just kind of fizzle away. The author behind the afterword for this book, which was paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould, does say, "On this matter, Simpson was a poor prophet by Magruder's anachronistic foresight." Anyways, back to the story, Sam also managed to find other raw materials in the valley along with other food sources. He even managed to find a rock overhang that served as his home. Everything seemed to be working out for Sam, even with all of the struggles that came with it. But the next obstacle that he was looking to overcome was making fire. Fire would open the door to a whole new area of opportunity for Sam's survival. Fire would keep him warm during the chilly nights, he could cook his food with it, it would serve as a means of protection, and it could even help him craft tools and supplies that he could make out of clay. He had made a couple of long attempts to start one from the old rubbing two sticks together method, and and the hitting two rocks together to make sparks method, but these ended in failure. But Sam is given just a bit more of a boost after lightning strikes a tree in the valley, causing a short but small fire that he's able to steal a flame from. He takes the flame back to his home, grows it, and manages to keep it alive for weeks before it ended up dying out on him, because he had been gone for too long from his home to be able to tend to it. Luckily, he was eventually able to figure out how to make a proper fire using the raw materials he gathered around the valley, so that problem was taken care of. These were just highlights of some of his experience. Trying to survive from the dinosaurs and the elements takes up the majority of his time, but I can imagine it's most likely repetitive things like trying to find food and resources and dodging dinosaurs when he encounters them. Over the next few years, he would do really well for himself, being able to craft tools, proper clothing, storage spaces for his food and supplies. When he's all settled, there's not much else that he does. When he isn't trying to avoid death at every turn, he chisels on his slab. Sometimes he goes out to admire the scenery and nature of the Cretaceous when, it's not trying to kill him. And he's even made instruments out of raw materials to play on his off time. All of these activities serve as distractions to the brutal Cretaceous world, and also, in a way, keeps him sane, because along with keeping him distracted from the dinosaurs and the elements, it also keeps him distracted from the sadness of his situation. But things do still get bad. For example, the Great Delirium. During the time Sam has been in the Cretaceous, he had not experienced any real major kind of illness or disease except for one incident. A point in time that he calls the Great Delirium, which took place during his first winter here. He would wake up one morning with a very bad headache and muscle soreness. He wouldn't be able to stomach any food because anything he ate, he would just immediately vomit out. It got so bad, he would end up blacking out from it. And what followed were very strange dreams, one of them being about his father. To Sam, it felt as if his father was really there with him, helping and comforting him and even talking to him. But when Sam would eventually wake up, he screamed to his father that he was all better now, only to realize that he was still all alone. In the Cretaceous, he would not be born for 80 million years. In the 22nd century, he was to die 10 years before my time slip. He was lost to me, as completely, irrevocably lost as all other human beings. I would never see him, or my mother, or my sister, or Lillian, or Fatima, or anyone else, except in delirium. I was alone. Starkly, hopelessly, eternally alone. Alone I remain, and must to the end. Then I wanted to die, but I could not. The fever had passed. I was alive, and I had to take up the burden of life again. Despite taking into account his situation, Sam doesn't seem to have it in him to end it for himself. Shortly after this segment, he goes on a tangent explaining how he keeps himself sane despite having no one to talk to, saying that even though his reality is unbearable, he keeps himself from fantasizing too much about the human world or people from the human world, because trying to evade his reality could cause him to go insane. He even says at one point regarding fantasizing about the human world that the easy way out was not for him. This could also apply to why he continues to survive here rather than ending it all. At this point in the story, we have gone through 6 of the 8 slabs that Sam had written on, and we actually take a break from Sam's story to focus back on the group of men that were introduced in the beginning of the book. After hearing Sam's story up to this point, the common man and the pragmatist are in a discussion for how they view Sam and his situation, with the common man seeing the whole thing as unbearably pathetic, which I think he means more in a way of pity and sympathy towards Sam rather than an insult to him. But the pragmatist disagrees, saying that to consider a man as being pathetic would be to consider them as being inferior to yourself. To him, Sam doesn't fit that description. Instead, the pragmatist describes Sam and his misfortunes as tragic. The ethnologist, however, disagrees with all of these takes. He actually believes Sam was extremely fortunate to be able to land such a rare opportunity to see things that no other humans would ever get a chance to see. It was a dream only a scientist could appreciate, and because Sam would rather sit there in his own sorrow, not appreciating his fortune, the ethnologist ethnologist doesn't see Sam as a true scientist. He was one of the luckiest men I have ever heard of. I think less of him that he did not consider the matter in that light. Instead of appreciating his luck, he went around feeling pathetic about himself. In other words, the ethnologist just sounds like the average Twitter user. Oh, sorry, X user. He even goes on to say that he would have gladly liked to have Sam's experience as any true scientist as well. He continues by saying Sam wasted many opportunities being the first and only man on Earth and could have done his part to guide and change history, even play God, but instead he only thought about his own survival. Yeah, who cares about survival? Who cares about eating and staying hydrated and not getting eaten by dinosaurs? No, you're a scientist. Play God instead, you fucking loser. Not gonna lie, that's kind of based. Or just stupid. Or both, I don't know. The ethnologist just doesn't really think much of Sam, because he continues his rant basically insulting him and calling his accomplishments of survival surface level and not that difficult, and just overall downplaying the severity of his situation, ending it off by saying Sam was too small of a man to appreciate his own experience. However, the Universal Historian doesn't fully agree and states that he thinks Sam did come to appreciate his experience, just not in a way that was satisfying to the ethnologist. The Universal Historian goes on to explain that Sam did appreciate his experience by accepting what he was, and in turn, he's come to appreciate the world and its history. This is expressed more in his 7th slab, which the story transitions back to. In this slab, Sam brings up a time shortly after completing his home in the Pentaceratops Valley where he reached a problem with food storage. By this point, he had managed to find, collect, and preserve all sorts of food, including seeds and fruits. He would dry the meat of his prey so that it would stay preserved for longer periods of time. But he began to notice that some of his food was disappearing, and eventually he found the culprit, which was a species of small prehistoric mammals, so he would set traps around his food storage area so they wouldn't eat his stuff. Eventually, he was able to collect enough of them to make a robe out of them, but he also managed to capture several of them alive and put them in wooden cages that he made. One day, as he was looking at one of them, he came to the realization that this was the very, very, very early precursor to the human race. And in a jokingly way, Sam refers to the prehistoric mammal as his great-grandpa. He would come to the realization that these prehistoric mammals were, unsurprisingly, not very bright. The intelligence behind the human race wouldn't be seen for millions of years, because as of right now, they were still oppressed by dinosaurs to advance in any kind of way. But Sam knew that if he really put his mind and effort to it, he could probably do something with these mammals, selectively breed them together and train and teach them to give them more of a head start on their evolution. But he ends up asking himself, why? Even if he were to increase the speed of human evolutionary history, what would be the point in that? One of the beauties of human evolution, and really just evolution as a whole, is that it happens on its own, and the interference just to speed up the process was completely unnecessary. Instead of playing God like the ethnologist said he could have done, Sam instead sees the what and why of himself. He is a man, he is not God, and the role he would play here would make little difference of the human race, because at the end of the day, with or without him, mankind will still emerge. With that, he opens the cage and lets great-grandpa go. And finally, we're on the final slab. It's a short one as it was made in haste given the unfortunate circumstances that would befall on Sam. The story never really tells the point in time Sam is in when he's writing or chiseling out on these slabs, but in the 8th one, he starts off by saying that he thinks at this point in time, he must be over 60 years old. To kind of give you an idea of how long he's been here, when he first was transported to the Cretaceous period, he was in his mid-40s. So yeah, he's been here for quite a while. He writes out his final message explaining that he doesn't have much time left, and he plans to bury the slabs in the swamp where he thinks they will be best preserved in, with the little hope he has that someone, someday, may find them and read his story. He then explains what had happened to him, how he had made yet another encounter with a Tyrannosaur, which at this point was nothing new. He had encountered and dodged these creatures many times over the years, but this caused him to become careless. He writes, "The brute, it was a tyrannosaur, got me by the leg. Fortunately, you might say, he shook me loose, tearing off the leg at the knee, and he didn't see where the rest of me fell. I tied up the stump and crawled away, but I'm done. That was yesterday, and I can't last much more than another day at best. I've had no joy, but a little satisfaction from this long ordeal. I have often wondered why I kept going. That, at least, I have learned, and I know it now at the end. There could be no hope and no reward. I always recognized that bitter truth. But I am a man, and a man is responsible for himself." The story ends back with the group of men from the beginning, with the common man simply stating, "May he rest in peace." The Dechronization of Sam Magruder is such an interesting book to me, not just because of the story itself, but because of how that story is presented. Usually, and this could just be because maybe I haven't personally expanded by reading or watching more things on this, but usually when I think of time traveling stories, I think of crazy, exciting adventures. I think of like an expedition or a group of people that are sent back in time and are forced to survive the prehistoric world. But the way it's portrayed makes it feel more like an action-adventure kind of tone. But this book really brings out the reality of that idea and presents it in a way that's much more depressing and serious, because it's not touted as this action-adventure story. It's a story about a man who fell into this situation by accident and was launched back in time to the age of the dinosaurs with absolutely nothing. Not even the clothes on his back, and he's forced to survive in this scenario. The way it's executed, it doesn't make it feel fun or exciting or adventurous. It makes it feel terrifying and dreadful. But in a way, it also opens your eyes to appreciating the simple things in life. Because after Sam was dechronized, I guess, he wasn't able to even experience anything that humans usually do in their everyday lives anymore, which can be as simple and mundane as listening to music or reading a book or talking with a friend. And there's just something about that when you really put yourself in his shoes. It just feels awful and terrifying. And on top of that, I think the worst thing about it is that no one would ever know about him or his situation had he not recorded it down on his slabs. I think that's the most terrifying part. It's not just being eternally alone that makes it unsettling, at least not completely, but also the idea that no one would ever know what you went through. No one, not you or anyone else, would get that kind of closure. There's a strong chance that no one will ever hear your story. And that is the other thing about this book that I find incredibly interesting. The thing about this book is that it was actually originally published in 1996. The book's author, George Gaylord Simpson, passed away in 1984. The only reason why this book has ever seen the light of day was because Simpson's daughter, Joan Simpson Burns, had found the manuscript of it in his workspace 10 years after he had passed away. After her father had died, Burns' stepmother would also pass away, leaving behind a lot of their work and possessions that would then be collected by her siblings and her parents' colleagues. A lot of what was left behind were historical and scientific research that were taken to be archived. But after all of that, 10 years after Simpson's death, there would still be a few files left behind. One of them being the Dechronization of Sam Magruder. Burns had also said that her father had actually had an interest in being a writer when he was a teenager, and would indulge in reading science fiction over the years from authors like Isaac Asimov, Dorothy Sayers, and Arthur C. Clarke. Actually, she had Clarke come on board to help her with the book by adding some commentary to the beginning of it. Her goal with this newfound manuscript was to try to find a home for it. Her father had spent the majority of his life studying the history of the world. He wrote books and papers based on his research, all of which had a place in his work. But the Dechronization was not a book on research, it was a science fiction book, one that was rather out of place for Simpson's usual line of work. Therefore, it needed a home. That's why she wrote to Arthur C. Clarke, so that he could help put it in that context of what it was. is. But knowing that a large part of the book was also grounded in real-world science, Burns would also write to Stephen Jay Gould, who agreed to help her put together the afterword of the book to help interpret to the reader all that Simpson was trying to say through his words. And finally, the book would be published by St. Martin's Press in 1996. See, this is what's so fascinating to me about this book. I mean, think about it real quick. Really think about the irony of its existence. This book about a man who's thrown back in time to the days of the dinosaurs and is forced to survive in a world that nobody knows he's even in, and writes his experiences down on stone slabs that, at best, have a slim chance of ever being discovered, was almost never released. And much like Magruder's story, was almost completely lost to the human world. Had Simpson's daughter not found this manuscript, not only would Sam's story almost have been lost in the book, but it also would have been lost in real life. And in that sense, at least to me, it makes this book just a little bit more special. Thank you all so much for watching, and please, have a nice day.